Hey, peace. What's happening, everyone? On our deal with.
Like the rushing of a mighty wind. Like the rushing of a mighty wind.
So Bacon's Rebellion has come up a lot in our readings recently, and it's explained as a turning point in American history in terms of race relations and the so-called caste system, the creation of the caste system that exists in America. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about Bacon's Rebellion. So I asked ChatGPT, what was Bacon's Rebellion? It says Bacon's Rebellion was a 1676 armed uprising in Colonial, Virginia, led by Nathaniel Bacon against Governor William Berkeley's government. On the surface, it looked like a dispute about frontier policy, but underneath, it exposed deep tensions about class, power, land, and labor. The basic definition: Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, a revolt by frontier settlers, indentured servants, and others against Virginia's colonial government. The leader, Nathaniel Bacon. Target, Governor William Berkeley. Immediate trigger: what sparked it? Conflict over Native American policy. Frontier settlers were angry because they faced native raids. Berkeley restricted expansion westward. Berkeley favored diplomacy and trade. Settlers wanted aggressive warfare. Bacon positioned himself as the defender of frontier farmers. But this was not just about Native Americans. That explanation alone is too shallow. The rebellion tapped into broader frustrations: land inequality, political exclusion, economic hardship, elite favoritism. Virginia society had growing divisions. Elites were large landowners, the lower classes were landless settlers. Elites had political power, the lower classes had little representation. Elites had wealth from tobacco, the lower classes had economic instability. Who joined the rebellion? Very important. Bacon's forces included poor white farmers, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, displaced laborers, frontier militias. This multi-group coalition is why historians consider it so significant. What actually happened? The sequence. 1. Bacon defies Berkeley. 2. Raises militia forces. 3. Attacks native groups. 4. Marches on Jamestown. 5. Jamestown is burned. 6. Colonial authority destabilized. For a time, the rebels controlled much of the colony. Why did the rebellion collapse? Several factors. Nathaniel Bacon dies from dysentery. Leadership fractures. English troops restore order. Rebels hunted down. The outcome: executions and reassertion of elite control. Why Bacon's Rebellion really matters historically? Because of its consequences, not just events. It exposed fragility of colonial rule, class resentment, danger of cross-class alliances, and most importantly, it changed elite strategy. The aftermath: a major social shift. Virginia elites responded by restructuring society. Gradual developments: hardening racial slave codes, expansion of hereditary slavery, reduced reliance on indentured servants, legal privileges for poor whites. Why? To prevent future uprisings like this. The deep structural insight. Elites learned that class unity was an existential threat. So the solution? Reorganize hierarchy along racial lines. Instead of rich versus poor, society stabilizes into white versus black. What Bacon's rebellion was not. It was not a modern democratic revolution. It was not purely anti-elite ideology. And it was not a simple race conflict. It was a volatile mix of frontier violence, class anger, power struggle, opportunism, and structural instability. Bacon's rebellion was a 1676 colonial Virginia uprising that began over frontier conflicts, but exposed class tensions and helped accelerate the shift toward a rigid racial caste system. I asked, why did white elites see Bacon's rebellion as a problem? It says white colonial elites saw Bacon's rebellion as a serious problem, not simply because it was violent, but because it exposed deep structural vulnerabilities in their social order. The core threat, cross-class unity. What truly alarmed elites was who rebelled together. The uprising united poor white settlers, indentured servants, enslaved Africans, and frontier farmers. For elites, this was the nightmare scenario, a multiracial, lower-class coalition directed against the ruling class. Before this period, social divisions in Virginia were shaped more by class than rigid racial hierarchy. Many laborers, European and African, shared similar conditions of exploitation. Bacon's rebellion demonstrated that these groups could recognize common grievances. Elites realized if poor whites and enslaved Africans align, elite authority collapses. 1. It challenged elite control. Governor William Berkeley and the planter elite governed through patronage, land distribution, and political exclusion. The rebellion exposed weak centralized authority, popular resentment of elite privilege, fragility of colonial governance. Jamestown was literally burned, a symbolic destruction of elite political power. 2. It revealed economic instability. Virginia's economy depended on land concentration, cheap labor, tobacco exports. Frontier settlers were angry about land scarcity, Native American conflicts, elite mobilization of opportunity. The rebellion showed how easily economic frustrations could turn into political violence. 3. It exposed the danger of indentured labor systems. At the time, elites relied heavily on indentured European servants. Problem: servants eventually became free. Freed servants demanded land. Land was increasingly scarce. This created a growing class of armed, landless, resentful whites. Bacon's rebellion proved they could revolt. 4. It triggered a strategic rethink. Racial caste system. Perhaps the most important consequence. Elites began restructuring society to prevent future class solidarity. They gradually shifted toward expanding African slavery, reducing reliance on indentured servants, granting poor whites small privileges. This created a clearer racial hierarchy, psychological alignment of poor whites with elites, division between white laborers and black laborers. In effect, race became a tool of social stabilization. Poor whites were given legal advantages, right to bear arms, land access, though limited, legal superiority over blacks. Even if economically poor, they were now racially elevated. Number 5. Fear of repeat uprisings. Elites interpreted the rebellion as a warning. Colonial society was volatile. Future risks included class revolts, slave rebellions, frontier militias turning political. The solution was tighter social stratification. The big picture insight. Bacon's rebellion mattered because it revealed a fundamental truth. Class conflict was more dangerous to elites than racial conflict. By hardening racial divisions, elites reduced the risk of unified uprisings. This is why many historians view Bacon's rebellion as a turning point in the development of American racial hierarchy, the legal codification of slavery, and the political identity of whiteness. I then asked, why was a racial hierarchy enough to appease poor whites who rebelled because of land inequality, political exclusion, economic hardship, and elite favoritism? Did the racial hierarchy address these concerns the rebels had? And I said that is exactly the right follow-up question, because it gets at a common misunderstanding. Short answer. Racial hierarchy did not solve poor whites' material problems. What it did was restructure incentives, identity, and relative status in ways that reduced the likelihood of unified revolt. So it sounds as if they were more interested in preventing a unified revolt than in really addressing the concerns that the rebels had. Says, let's unpack this carefully. Did racial hierarchy address the rebels' core grievances? The rebels' complaints were largely land scarcity, political exclusion, economic hardship, and elite favoritism. Race policy did not magically provide land or wealth. Most poor whites remained poor. So if conditions didn't fundamentally improve, why did instability decline? Key mechanism number 1, relative status versus absolute conditions. Human behavior is strongly shaped by relative position, not just material condition. Even if a poor white farmer remained economically strained, racial hierarchy granted legal superiority, social dominance, psychological status. Poor whites became above enslaved blacks, protected by law, members of the politically dominant group. This matters enormously. Status can stabilize systems even when inequality persists. Key mechanism number 2, legal privileges, small but powerful. Poor whites gained tangible advantages that were modest but meaningful. Lighter criminal punishments, right to bear arms, access to militias, voting rights for many, land access on expanding frontier, eventually, protection from lifetime hereditary bondage. These were not riches, but they created a floor of security absent for black laborers. Key mechanism number 3, psychological wage, huge concept. Later articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois, psychological wage of whiteness. Even without wealth, poor whites received public respect, civic inclusion, social recognition, sense of belonging to ruling society. Instead of, I am exploited alongside them, it became, at least I am not them. Brutally effective social engineering. Key mechanism number 4, breaking class solidarity. Before rigid racialization, shared hardship became potential alliances. After racial hierarchy hardens, shared hardship became divided interpretation. Poor whites and black laborers now occupied different legal worlds. Cross-racial cooperation became riskier, less intuitive, socially punished. Elite stability increases when lower classes stop seeing themselves as a unified group. Key mechanism number 5, channeling frustration laterally. Instead of anger flowing upward toward elites, anger often redirected sideways or downward. This is a recurring pattern in hierarchical systems. Economic stress plus status anxiety leads to scapegoating dynamics. Elites don't need everyone satisfied. They need dissatisfaction diffused. Important reality check. Poor whites still struggled. Racial hierarchy did not eliminate debt, land pressure, labor competition, elite dominance, but it altered how inequality was perceived, who was blamed, who was seen as ally versus rival. Why this works without solving inequality? Because revolts require shared grievances, shared identity, shared enemy perception. Racial hierarchy disrupts all three. Deep structural insight. Elites did not fix instability. They managed instability. Instead of reducing inequality, which is hard and costly, they reorganized social meaning, created cross-class racial alignment, institutionalized division. It's cheaper, durable, and historically common. Did racial hierarchy appease poor whites? Not in the sense of solving hardship. More accurately, it provided relative advantages. It offered status compensation. It reduced fear of falling to bottom. It reshaped political loyalties, enough to stabilize the system. Why this interpretation matters? Because it explains something many people struggle with: how deeply unequal systems persist. Why economically disadvantaged groups defend hierarchies. Why class politics fragment. This is not unique to colonial America. It's a recurring political pattern globally. Before going global, I asked ChatGPT to compare what was going on in the English colonies like Virginia with what was going on in the Spanish and French colonies. And it said, now this is a very good question, because comparing English, Spanish, and French colonies reveals that racial hierarchy was not inevitable. It was structured differently depending on economic systems, labor needs, and imperial governance styles. Let's walk through the contrasts clearly. English colonies, the Virginia model. Rigid racial caste system emerges. After the late 1600s, English colonies increasingly developed binary racial structure, hereditary racial slavery, hard legal boundaries. Characteristics: white versus black becomes dominant divide. Slavery becomes permanent and race-based. Interracial mobility collapses. Why? Plantation labor system, tobacco and labor large enslaved population, fear of class alliances, Bacon's rebellion context, and less centralized imperial bureaucracy. The outcome: sharp racial lines and limited mixed categories. In the Spanish colonies, there were complex racial gradation systems, a Caste system. Spain governed differently. Instead of a binary racial order, there was a multi-tier racial classification. Spain recognized mixed identities, and there were greater but unequal mobility. Categories included Español, Mestizo, Mulatto, Castizo, Zambo, and dozens more. Why this structure? Massive racial mixing from early conquest. smaller European settler population, Catholic conversion model, Iberian traditions of legal pluralism, different labor systems, encomienda and repartimiento. The key difference: race equals a graded spectrum, not a rigid wall. Even though hierarchy existed, it was not strictly binary and not fully locked. Mixed individuals could sometimes whiten socially. In the French colonies, there was a more fluid social boundaries, with limits. In French colonial societies in the Caribbean and Louisiana, etc., often showed greater recognition of mixed populations, intermediate statuses, and less rigid racial absolutism. Especially notable, free people of color, jeunes de couleur libres. These groups could own property, receive education, sometimes own slaves, participate in commerce. Why more fluidity? There were smaller settler populations, different plantation management, Catholic social doctrine, different demographic balance, and less entrenched binary ideology early on. But important caution: fluid does not mean equal. Racial hierarchy still existed, yet the lines were softer. Social categories were more layered. Why English colonies became more rigid? This is the critical comparative insight. English America developed larger enslaved populations, more European settlers, stronger land-based class tensions, greater fear of cross-class revolt. Binary racial hierarchy served as labor control, social stabilization, and political alliance mechanism. Spanish and French colonies didn't face identical pressures. So visualizing the structural differences, the feature racial logic. In English colonies, it was binary. In Spanish colonies, it was a graded spectrum. And in French colonies, it was layered or intermediate. The next feature is mixed identities. In English colonies, it was discouraged. In Spanish colonies, it was institutionalized, and in French colonies, it was recognized. Social mobility was restricted in English colonies, limited but possible in Spanish colonies, and also limited but possible in French. Slavery structure. Racially rigid in the English colonies, racial but complex in Spanish colonies, and racial but flexible in French colonies. And the elite strategy: divide via race in the English colonies, govern diversity in Spanish colonies, and manage hybrid societies in French colonies. Economic systems matter, a huge factor. Different labor systems led to different racial systems. English plantation slavery needed permanently subordinated labor force, clear boundaries, and no ambiguity. Spanish colonial labor relied more on indigenous labor systems, tribute systems, and racial mixing from conquest. French colonial systems often was a smaller scale, with hybrid economies and urban commercial centers. The big historical insight: race was shaped by demography, labor economics, imperial governance, fear of revolt, religious ideology. Not simply prejudice. All empires were hierarchical, but they organized hierarchy differently. Why this comparison is important today? Because it disrupts myths like racial hierarchy was natural. All colonies worked the same way. Instead, we see social categories are politically engineered. Race systems are historically contingent. Governance structures shape identity. I then asked ChatGPT to go back and speak to how hierarchies in colonial America was a recurring political pattern globally. And it said, good, let's widen the lens, because once you compare other societies, you start seeing this as a general political strategy, not an American anomaly. We'll look at Brazil, the Caribbean, and South Africa, three very different racial orders that solved the same elite problem. How do you stabilize extreme inequality? Brazil, racial fluidity instead of binary vision. Brazil developed almost the opposite model of Anglo-America. Instead of rigid binary race, there was a highly graded racial spectrum, extensive racial mixing, and many intermediate identities. Categories were socially recognized rather than strictly legal. Branco, white, Pardo, mixed, Preto, black, numerous shades and gradations. Why elites tolerated fluidity? Brazil had massive racial mixing, smaller European population, different labor dynamics. Rigid binary lines would have been impractical. Instead, elites maintained hierarchy through color gradation plus class position. Result, a less rigid race war, but inequality still deeply racialized. Whitening became aspirational. Status was elastic but directional. Key contrast with English colonies. In Anglo-America, there were clear racial membership, hard boundaries, and stable binary categories. In Brazil, there were blurred boundaries, mobility narratives, and hierarchy embedded in gradation. Different mechanisms, but similar inequality persistence. In the Caribbean, there was extreme racial stratification with intermediate buffers. Caribbean colonies often produced multi-layer racial systems, free people of color as buffer class, extreme wealth concentration. Structure often looked like elite whites, then free mixed or free black intermediates, and enslaved majority at the bottom. Why this system mattered? Free people of color could own property, run businesses, sometimes own slaves, act as economic intermediaries. This created a stabilizing middle layer, but also intense tensions, Haiti being the most explosive example. Important lesson: intermediate racial classes can stabilize hierarchy, but also become revolutionary actors. Saint Dominique proves this dramatically. Too much exclusion, and the system detonates. South Africa, race as total political architecture. Apartheid represents racial hierarchy in its most explicit modern form. Race determined residence, employment, education, political rights, and movement. This was not subtle. It was engineered at state level. Why poor whites supported apartheid? Critical parallel to the earlier question. Many whites were not wealthy elites, yet apartheid provided job protection, wage protection, political dominance, legal superiority. Even economically marginal whites received structural insulation from black competition. Again, relative status plus security floor was greater than class solidarity. Common practice across all three. Despite very different racial logics, Anglo-America had a binary racial structure, and the elite goal was to prevent class coalitions. Brazil had a graded spectrum as their racial structure, and the elite goal was to preserve hierarchy amid mixing. In the Caribbean, there was a layered or intermediate racial structure, and the elite goal was to stabilize plantation inequality. And in South Africa, there was a rigid state-race system as their racial structure, and the elite goal was to lock political and economic control. There was a different design, but the same function. Manage instability from inequality. Deep structural insight. Grade systems often operate as labor control systems, status distribution systems, and coalition management systems, not just prejudice structures. Prejudice alone cannot sustain centuries-long systems. Political incentives can. Why binary systems are especially powerful. Binary systems, like Anglo-America, are unusually stabilizing because they simplify identity, clarify hierarchy, reduce ambiguity, and harden coalition boundaries. Graded systems create more mobility stories. Binary systems create stronger group walls. Modern echoes. This is where it gets very contemporary. Your earlier questions connect directly to why identity politics often overrides class politics, why cross-class alliance persist, why economic hardship doesn't always produce class revolt. Because humans organize around relative status, group security, identity stability, not purely material conditions. I asked ChatGPT, how are hierarchies, racial or otherwise, maintained today? Said hierarchies today are maintained less through explicit law, like slavery or apartheid, and more through self-reinforcing systems that shape opportunity, perception, risk, and mobility. Modern hierarchies survive because they often feel natural, merit-based, cultural, or market-driven, even when structural forces are doing much of the work. Let's break this down in a grounded way. 1. Economic structures, the quiet engine. Wealth inequality is the backbone of most modern hierarchies. Key mechanisms: intergenerational wealth transfer, asset ownership versus wage dependence, compounding returns. Wealth produces advantages that income alone cannot. Better neighborhoods, better schools, better networks, lower risk exposure, more second chances. Hierarchy persists without anyone actively enforcing it. It becomes mathematically sticky. 2. Educational sorting systems. Education is a major stratification machine, not just learning, but credential filtering mechanisms. School district funding tied to property wealth, access to elite institutions, credential inflation, social signaling. Schools often reproduce class position because early advantages lead to better preparation leads to better placement, and better placement leads to better income. Loop closes. 3. Social and professional networks, invisible but huge. Opportunities flow through networks more than formal rules. People hire, invest, mentor, and partner through familiarity, trust, cultural comfort, and shared background. This creates network clustering, opportunity concentration. No conspiracy required, just human behavior. 4. Cultural capital and norm signaling. Status today often rides on behavioral codes, not just money. Speech patterns, dress, taste, confidence, institutional fluency. These act as gatekeeping signals. Those fluent in dominant norms move more easily. Others face friction. 5. Risk distribution and cushioning, a massively underrated mechanism. Highest status groups often enjoy greater margin for error, financial buffers, legal resources, reputation insulation. Lower status groups face higher penalty for mistakes, less recovery capacity. Same error, leading to different consequences. Hierarchy stabilizes. 6. Residential and geographic segmentation. Physical space still matters enormously. Where you live shapes school quality, safety, peer effects, job access, policing patterns, health outcomes. Segregation today is often not de jure, but economically driven. Result can look similar. 7. Algorithmic and institutional feedback loops. Modern systems increasingly automate stratification. Examples: credit scoring, hiring filters, predictive policing, college admissions metrics, recommendation algorithms. Algorithms often inherit historical patterns. They amplify existing distributions. 8. Identity and group dynamics. This connects directly to your earlier hierarchy questions. Humans seek relative status, group belonging, position stability. Identity categories can shape political coalitions, resource competition narratives, and social trust boundaries. Hierarchies persist when groups fear downward mobility, prefer relative advantage over absolute equality. Again, recurring historical pattern. Number 9, meritocracy narratives, psychological stabilizer. Modern hierarchy is often legitimated through outcomes reflect effort and talent. Meritocracy is partly real, partly structural, partly mythologized. But crucially, it reduces perceived illegitimacy. It lowers revolt pressure. It individualizes failure. People blame themselves rather than systems. The deep structural insight. Modern hierarchies survive because enforcement is often less visible, less centralized, less overtly coercive, and more emergent, more distributed, more systemic, and more self-reinforcing, which makes them harder to see, harder to challenge, harder to agree upon. Important reality check. Not all hierarchy equals oppression. Some hierarchy emerges from skill differences, specialization, incentive systems, organizational efficiency. The real debates today center on mobility versus rigidity, fairness versus capture, opportunity versus inheritance, merit versus structural advantage. Finally, I asked ChatGPT to summarize how Bacon's Rebellion shaped racial hierarchy in America and how that hierarchy persists today. It says Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, did not create racial hierarchy, but it dramatically clarified why colonial elites would deepen and formalize it. Before the rebellion, Virginia's social order was harsh but comparatively fluid. Class divisions mattered more than later racial ones. European indentured servants, poor settlers, and enslaved Africans often occupied overlapping economic positions. Boundaries existed, but they were not yet the rigid, inherited racial caste system that would define later America. The rebellion changed elite perceptions of risk. What made it alarming was not simply violence, but coalition. Poor whites, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans aligned, however temporarily, against the colonial government. This exposed a structural danger. Class-based solidarity could destabilize elite power. From the standpoint of governance, shared economic grievance was more threatening than racial difference. In the decades that followed, elites gradually reorganized the labor system and legal order. Hereditary, race-based slavery hardened. Laws increasingly distinguished white from black in clear, enforceable ways. Poor Europeans, even when economically marginal, received relative privileges, lighter punishments, political inclusion, land access, and legal superiority. Whiteness became not just a description, but a status category with material and psychological value. Crucially, this did not solve class inequality. Many poor whites remained poor. What changed was the structure of comparison. Instead of a society where hardship might produce cross-class alliances, hierarchy became organized around racial position. Relative status reduced incentives for unified revolt. Race functioned as a stabilizer in a deeply unequal system. That logic, managing inequality through layered advantage rather than eliminating inequality, echoes forward. Modern hierarchies persist less through explicit racial law and more through self-reinforcing systems. Wealth accumulation, education access, residential patterns, professional networks, and risk distribution all shape opportunity in ways that often risk historical inequalities. These mechanisms produce stratification without requiring overt exclusion. The system feels meritocratic, even when starting positions differ sharply. Identity still plays a stabilizing role. People interpret economic outcomes through group position, cultural narratives, and relative status concerns. Class solidarity remains difficult when identities structure trust, belonging, and perceived competition. As in the colonial period, dissatisfaction need not disappear. It only needs to fragment. The persistence is therefore not a simple survival of old racial rules, but a continuity of structural dynamics. Hierarchies endure when inequality is normalized, when advantages compound across generations, and when political conflict organizes more easily around identity than shared economic position. Bacon's rebellion matters because it illuminates an early turning point where elites learned a durable lesson. Broad class coalitions are destabilizing, while differentiated status systems are stabilizing. The forms have evolved, but the governing logic, managing inequality through structured division and incentive alignment, remains recognizable today. So I guess my understanding at this point is that the main difference between the hierarchies that existed in the late 1600s, those hierarchies were intentional and conscious. The elites at that time made intentional, conscious decisions to create racial hierarchies, or at least that's how it sounds as if ChatGPT is presenting this. And the hierarchies that exist today are more structural or systemic or not intentional. They are unconscious, and the elite, I guess, are just people that benefit from those structures and didn't really intend for them to be there, for those hierarchical structures to be there. And, I guess I'm still having my issues with both of them, understanding why one had to be intentional and the other is non-intentional or structural. I still have questions about that. Questions that I may or may not ask on a later video. If you like this video, like the video. If you didn't like the video, tell us why you didn't like the video. Maybe we'll talk about it in a later video. Either way, like or not, subscribe to the channel because there are going to be more videos. Things that I think are just important to talk about. And you don't know, we're going to catch you on the next one. Peace.
I want you to listen very, very carefully.
Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Brought us from the motherland in bondage and chains. Bury our culture and change our names. They claim we're free, yet we are in pain. As long as there's life, there's a lot to gain. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. When God spoke his words, they said he was deranged. Marley sung his songs, they said the same. Malcolm X and Martin Luther fought relentlessly so we could be better. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Brought us from the motherland in bondage and chains. Bury our culture and change our names. They claim we're free, yet we are in pain. As long as there's life, there's a lot to gain. Just because we're black, they say we are slaves. Speak of righteousness, they say we are praise. Just because we're black, they say